Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the debate for the Harvard Board of Overseers. My name is Matthew Young. I am a 2012 graduate of the college. I am a fourth-year medical student at the Harvard Medical School and a first-year law student at the Harvard Law School. I am also the president of the American Association for Justice chapter at Harvard Law School. We are one of the co-sponsors of this event, along with the Harvard Republicans. I'm just going to give a few quick introductions. Today, our panel will be moderated by Pete Davis. Pete is a civic reformer from Falls Church, Virginia. He is a member of the Harvard College class of 2012 and Harvard Law School class of 2018. He's also the online editor of the Harvard Law Record, the longest-running law school newspaper in the country. And you can learn more about Pete at civicideas.org. So, as you just heard, representing Free Harvard, Fair Harvard is Ron Unz. Ron is a graduate of the 1983 class. He's chairman of the Free Harvard, Fair Harvard campaign and currently the leading Republican U.S. Senate candidate in California. Representing the opposition is our two students. On the left is Danny Solomon. Danny's an undergraduate in Pforzheimer House from Queens, New York. He's a social studies concentrator, and thank you, Danny, for joining us. With him is Loran He. Loran is an undergraduate sophomore in Leverett House from New York, concentrating in mathematics and philosophy. Ethics is his passion. He also sings with the Harvard Glee Club and performed in the East Coast premiere of Considering Matthew Shepard. Loran, thank you for joining us. So I'm going to hand it over to Pete to start the debate. Thanks, Pete.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. There is a meme going around that universities and East Coast universities like Harvard don't believe in the free exchange of ideas, but this is a testament to the fact that we are here debating a tender and controversial topic. The way we're going to do this is we're going to have Ron speak for 5 minutes, and then Dan and Loran speak for 5 minutes, just laying out their opening arguments, and then it's going to be very free form, a conversation back and forth. I might pepper in some questions. I might make sure that the direction of the conversation remains clear, but open dialogue back and forth. After a bit, I'm going to open it up for a mix of your questions and statements coming in as well. My only ground rules is this is a very tender topic that elicits much passion in many people, and so that's great. No need to not be passionate about it, but we're going to not have personal attacks of any kind, and we're going to try to keep it to just on track of building understanding of where everyone's coming from on this. So without further ado, let's bring it to Ron.
Well, anyway, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. And I think whether you agree with our position or you disagree with our position, I think everybody would agree that this is probably the most momentous overseer vote for Harvard University, at least in the last 25 years, maybe even in the last 100 years. And the best way people can discuss these important issues and decide on them and decide how they'll vote is, I think, an exchange of ideas. And that's why I'm very gratified that we've been able to now arrange this debate to discuss these important issues. Now, in my opening discussion, I think what I'll do is just give a very brief overview of where we stand. Oops, sorry about that. Disorganized. You know, our platform, the Free Harvard, Fair Harvard platform, consists of two equal portions. The first is that Harvard is so wealthy, so enormously wealthy, that it can and should completely abolish undergraduate tuition. And the best way of understanding that argument is simply to look at the facts. This chart represents a scale of Harvard's annual investment income in blue in each of these years. The red is Harvard's annual net tuition revenue. Net tuition revenue is 1/25 of what Harvard earns of its investments. Harvard, in effect, is a gigantic hedge fund, one of the world's largest hedge funds, with a little college attached off to the side for tax purposes so that it doesn't have to pay taxes. Now, if Goldman Sachs bought a community college and declared itself tax exempt, that would be absurd. And that's not too different from what's really happening at Harvard. So at the very least, huge hedge funds should not charge tuition. And we think it would be much better for our society and better for Harvard if Harvard immediately abolished tuition, which it's very easy to do. If Harvard abolished tuition, then Yale, Princeton, and Stanford, that have much the same disproportionate size of their endowment income relative to their tuition, would probably follow Harvard's lead and abolish tuition as well. And all of this would have massive implications for American society and American higher education. And it would probably start the largest change in American higher education in the last 50 years. And I very much advocate this. The other aspect to our campaign is Fair Harvard. And that's based on the idea, the documented facts, that there's a tremendous amount of bias and unfairness and really almost outright corruption probably taking place in the Harvard admissions process. The area in which I focused the most over years has been the issue of what seems to be strong statistical evidence for an Asian quota at Harvard. These are the statistics showing the current level of admissions rates, enrollment rates for Asian students at all of the Ivy League schools over a period of about 20-25 years. It seems very strange that all those numbers have converged on a very narrow level, that all of them have almost exactly the same number of students each year being enrolled in their undergraduate college. And all of that has happened while the Asian American population, which is given by this figure, has dramatically increased. Now, when the Asian American population over the last 25 years has more than doubled, while the number of Asian American students enrolled at Harvard is roughly the same as it was 25 years ago, in some cases maybe a little bit lower, that means the per capita enrollment of Asian American students at Harvard University, Harvard College, has dropped by about 60%. Now, that seems very strange. Now, it doesn't prove that Harvard is biased against Asians, but when there's been a drop of 60% in per capita Asian American enrollment, at the very least, it raises questions of why is that happening, and why does the administration refuse to provide any of the explanation for it? So what we're advocating is that Harvard College, as part of our platform, should simply provide much more transparency in their admissions process. They should provide much more of an explanation why they're admitting some students and not other students. And the truth is, I think there's a lot of evidence, both anecdotal and statistical evidence, that students get admitted to Harvard for the wrong reasons. Their parents, in effect, pay a lot of money, what almost amounts to bribery to the university, in some cases amounting to millions of dollars to get a certain student who doesn't deserve to be a student admitted. And probably the most egregious case was documented in Daniel Golden's book, The Price of Admission, where Donald Trump's son-in-law was admitted to Harvard even though he was totally unqualified because his very wealthy family paid millions of dollars to Harvard. I think that's wrong, and I think Harvard should be much more transparent in admissions, and I've already probably gone past my time, so I'll give it to the other side, and we'll certainly discuss these issues in the next hour or two. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Ron.
To clarify, I don't know about Danny, but I do not speak on behalf of the Coalition for Diverse Harvard. I only speak on behalf of myself. I'm sorry if that wasn't made clear earlier.
Yes, that's also true. We are not representing a coalition for a diverse Harvard. We are merely two students who feel more comfortable with its position than the position taken by Free Harvard, Fair Harvard. That being said, I want to thank Ron for his opening statement, and I hope that we can show that leftists know how to debate today. That being said, I think that to start with the proposal for free tuition, we think that that is a giveaway to wealthy students at the college. Currently, Harvard has a very generous financial aid program. those who make under $65,000 in their family income receive free room, almost free cost of attendance. The median household income in this country is $60,000, thereabouts. If you make up to $150,000, your cost of attendance is capped at 10% of your family income. That would make it cheaper than tuition and room and board at most state universities. And I think that Ron's side understates the generosity of financial aid that continues above that level, especially for those whose parents have multiple children in college. And so I think that this proposal masquerades as something that would help poorer students into the college, and mostly it turns out to be a benefit for wealthy and upper middle class individuals here at the college. Now, Ron says that it's a universal benefit. Why should college tuition be different from Social Security? That's what Free Harvard, Fair Harvard says. Well, Social Security is a government benefit, and there are very specific reasons that Social Security covers all people. One of those reasons is for social cohesion. I would argue that affirmative action is also necessary for social cohesion in this country, that it's in the national interest. And where Ron's side says that it merely wants to get statistics on anti-Asian bias in admissions, I think what it really wants to do is open up the floodgates for a campaign against affirmative action on this campus. I think that that is negative. I think that it is divisive. I also think that it very much overlooks the benefits of diversity on this campus and the enduring realities of anti-Black racism in this country. So I hope that as we move into this debate, we can explore those issues and have them out in a respectful and productive way.
There's a minute more if you want to use the tape.
Ron, would I be able to ask you a question?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect.
Let's open it up.
All right, so someone on your slate, Ivy Chang, has said that, and I quote, "Free Harvard is just a slogan. Harvard will not be free." And he notes that students will still pay room and board, which currently I believe is listed at over 15,000. So would you, well, first of all, are you aware that there are undergraduate students on campus that are working to provide for their families at home?
Yes, probably in some cases, certainly.
Do you think that the increase from financial aid covering room and board at the current time to the plan that Chang proposes is reasonable?
Well, we're not raising room and board. In other words, all we're doing is abolishing tuition. In other words, students right now who don't pay room and board wouldn't pay room and board under our system either. All we're doing is impacting tuition. In other words, the whole thing is, personally, I think room and board expenses are much too high at Harvard. And I think it's perfectly reasonable, to be honest, for Harvard either to eliminate room and board costs entirely or maybe reduce them. And in fact, room and board expenses are about 15% of total undergraduate costs. Tuition is about 80%. So to simplify our focus, we're simply saying we abolish tuition, which is the 80% issue, and not really saying anything about room and board one way or the other. Though personally, I think a case could be made that maybe room and board should also be abolished or at least reduced for everybody. But we're not impacting, on our platform, we're not impacting the current room and board situation one way or the other.
So to be clear, low-income students who currently receive room and board subsidies under current financial aid programs would not, per se, lose those.
Oh, of course,
if tuition
exactly.
were abolished.
They wouldn't
Okay.
get more.
So I'm going to butt in here. So there's two issues at hand with Free Harvard, Fair Harvard, and I think it's good to linger on one of them for a while, even though I bet Ron would say that they are connected, but I think let's split them for a while. So on the question of free Harvard, which is what we're lingering on, what seems to have been raised is a question of entitlement versus means testing, which, for example, in the presidential campaign was raised by a Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton debate of free college, and then Hillary Clinton says, oh, you're gonna send Donald Trump's kid to college for free. So a question for Ron and Dan and Loran, and after Ron answers, is, you know, the greatest case for a means test is why spend this money on just proving a point that you don't know what the answer is, and when that money could be better spent instead of proving the point on, say, paying adjuncts more, which you've said should happen, you know, paying support staff more, saving a department, when we're not sure if this alleged, you know, shot heard around the world will happen. Why have it be an entitlement instead of a means test?
Well, I mean, the whole thing there is the dollars involved are so utterly trivial. Now, it's true, for example, if somebody, say, comes from a very wealthy family, maybe even family of billionaires, they obviously don't need the money. They could very easily afford to write Harvard a check for a couple $100,000 or, you know, whatever the total tuition is. And Harvard doesn't need the money either. So you basically have no need for the money on either side. And to be honest, the average billionaire family doesn't really care whether they have to pay Harvard tuition or not. I mean, the dollars are really trivial. What the problem you have right now is not that Harvard refuses to subsidize the education of lower income students. And, you know, just as was raised, any family that has income of less than $65,000 a year doesn't have to pay $1 to send their children to Harvard, and that's a good idea. I certainly support that. The problem is very few such families even apply to Harvard because they don't know about that. Now, you know, when they look at the Harvard website or they read about Harvard and they find that annual Harvard tuition is $60,000 a year and their family income is $60,000 a year, they think it's impossible. They think it's ridiculous. And Harvard then is surprised about the fact that very few low-income students apply. In fact, what's interesting is that studies have been done showing that even when you account for academic performance, in other words, when you look at students of equal academic ability and performance, ones who come from lesser wealthy families are much, much less likely to even bother applying to these elite universities. If Harvard tuition is free, everybody will know about it within a week in the United States. And then if a family, for example, is thinking of sending their very successful, very hard-working child to a local college where tuition is $5,000 a year, and they hear about Harvard being free, free sounds a lot better than $5,000. So Harvard would immediately have a massive inflow of applicants from the lower end of the economic spectrum, from families who never even considered the possibility of a Harvard education. And I think that would be much better for the country. So, you know, the truth is, a billionaire doesn't care whether Harvard is free or Harvard is not free. Harvard, which has $38 billion in the bank, doesn't really care either. So under those circumstances, I think it's better to look at the overall impact of Harvard abolishing tuition and the contingent impact on all these other colleges around the United States, including public colleges and universities. And I think in politics, in public policy, simplicity is a very powerful weapon to use. If Harvard issued a press release tomorrow saying that they were modifying their financial aid formula to make it easier for lower income students to successfully attend Harvard, it would get 2 sentences on the bottom of page 823 of the newspapers, and nobody would know about it. If Harvard declared it was abolishing tuition for all undergraduates, that story would be on the front pages of half the world's newspapers. And in a few days, everybody in America would hear about it. And the impact would be enormous in American society. Harvard doesn't need the money. And so if they don't need the money, they shouldn't charge it. And I think that's the most logical approach to take.
I mean, the idea that because an institution can afford something, it should do it, has been rejected by the Harvard administration. Under your logic, the endowment should be a piggy bank to support, anything that can be deemed affordable within the scope of a large pot of money. I would also say that this is sort of conjecture, what you're bringing up. The idea that the most effective way, the best way to recruit low-income students to the college is to abolish tuition and effectively engage in a marketing scam, because that's sort of what it seems to be to me, in the sense that it doesn't really affect any outcome for those students. In fact, mostly it would benefit upper middle class families. That doesn't necessarily follow. That doesn't follow for me because there are other ways that Harvard could bolster its outreach to those families without abolishing tuition. For example, it can ramp up its marketing campaign, which has had some success in bolstering the number of students who are middle class, lower middle class, and poor at the college in the past 3 decades or so. Or, I think, policies coming out of the Harvard Financial Aid Office now, giving startup grants of about $2,000 to new students at the college to cover transitional costs of moving and setting up at college, are also another valid way to address this problem. There doesn't seem to me to be empirical evidence on your side to suggest that the abolition of tuition fees at Harvard would necessarily proceed to a surge in low-income applications. I also want to highlight, because Pete raised the issue of how this relates to the national debate between Hillary and Bernie over means testing versus entitlement. On a national level, let's remember, 2% of Americans make over $250 family income, if I recall correctly. They are the wealthy to benefit from Bernie Sanders' free college proposal. 40% of students at the college are not on financial aid. And to not be on financial aid here means that you are upper middle class and wealthy. So we're talking at very different populations. We're talking at different entities. Harvard is a private institution. It operates according to its own logic. The public sector operates according to its own logic as well. The reason that we have a Social Security mandate to cover all people is because it's a very powerful tool that builds support for social welfare programs. So I don't think that one can translate the logic of the public sector into the private sector and nationally into the very distorted world that is Harvard relative to the rest of the country. So I would just challenge Ron on these comparisons, which I find to be sort of disingenuous.
Look, the truth is, when you look, for example, at the Harvard financial aid system, you can go on the Harvard website, and there's a calculator where you can put in the numbers. Now, it turns out there was a big story in the New York Times that Harvard prevents comparison shopping. In other words, they've set up a software block that prevents anybody from easily comparing the Harvard net cost for their family with all the other colleges. And it's sort of a little bit dishonest. But the point is, you can type in all your information there, but it's a very confusing system. If you're talking about a working class family or a less well-educated family or an immigrant family, exactly the people that Harvard is allegedly trying to attract, it's not the simplest system to put in all that information. In fact, I made a couple of mistakes when I was doing it myself, and I'm a software guy. But it turns out, when you look, for example, at the Harvard Financial Aid Calculator, one interesting case is Harvard says, well, we provide free tuition or almost free tuition for middle-class families. Now, if you're a pair of public school teachers in New York City, and you type in the financial numbers for your income based on New York City public school teacher rates, a family like that has to pay their life savings to send their daughter or son to Harvard. It's like $150,000 or $200,000 a year they need to spend. So Harvard may claim that they only gouge the rich, that they only soak the rich. But I don't normally call a pair of married public school teachers living in New York City as the rich that they're sort of trying to gouge. I'm not saying Harvard is doing it intentionally. I'm saying Harvard has a very complex, very convoluted financial aid formula that probably was developed by derivatives traders or something like that. And because of setting the way it is, it ends up gouging New York City public school teachers. And if Harvard wasn't even aware of that, it really shows that the system doesn't make sense. In other words, look, simple is a very valuable approach to take. If Harvard says tuition is free, I think a lot more people will apply to Harvard. And, you know, the whole thing about it, say, for example, you're a very wealthy family right now. You know, let's say you're worth $100 million or $50 million. Do you really care about your son or daughter having to spend $200,000 to go to Harvard? No. $200,000 is what you spend on postage stamp money. What you care about is a lot of extra applicants applying to Harvard that might make it more difficult for your son or daughter to get in, especially if things get more fair in the admissions process. So you have a vested interest in making sure that there are fewer applicants from the lower end of the economic spectrum or from middle-class families competing with your son or daughter to apply. So basically, I would argue that wealthy families would normally be very unhappy about the idea that there could be a change in policy that might cost them a few extra dollars that they don't really care about, but would increase the number of applicants, and it might make it more difficult for their son or daughter to get in. Or maybe they'd have to pay much higher bribes than what they pay right now. I mean, the truth is, say we right now have a public road system, a freeway system in the United States that lets people drive on the freeways for free. They drive on the freeways for free if they're rich, or they drive on the freeways for free if they're poor. You could imagine all these people saying, you know, advocates saying, it's unfair that millionaires can drive on the freeways for free. We should set up a means-tested, dollar-based, income-based formula so that whenever you drive on the freeway, the amount of money you pay per mile is based on your income. And it's such a complicated formula that nobody understands how it works. And what you end up with is a lot of people would be very reluctant to drive on the freeway, especially poorer people, because they're scared that they would have to pay a lot of money that they couldn't afford. Harvard going to zero tuition is something everybody could understand, and it would draw in exactly the sort of lower income students that Harvard claims that they want, but are doing a very poor job right now of actually attracting.
I'm sorry, I actually misunderstood the free Harvard, fair Harvard position on free Harvard, and I actually agree with it.
Oh, we've won another vote right now.
Well, I'm not so ready to concede. I still think that you haven't substantiated this with empirical evidence. I agree with you that there is value in simplicity, but I'd also challenge you to come up with those school teachers, please. And to that point, I'd like to say, to bring in some personal, anecdote. I am the son of two public servants from Queens who make in that range. I have two siblings in college, and I am heavily subsidized to attend this university. So I would just challenge you. I would challenge your presentation of tuition costs as backbreaking and as cruel, directly above the 150 level. I just think that's false, based on my own sort of personal experience and from talking to others. I also think, think about how generous Harvard's financial aid program is currently. It doesn't count home equity. That's a significant asset. I think that you are still talking about a subsidy for high net worth households by any definition. And to your point, again, I think it's really valuable for us to distinguish between public goods and private goods. This is a private good. It doesn't necessarily follow that that Harvard should operate according to the logic of the public system. Perhaps this could be a plan that would be implemented at Berkeley. I don't know. But I do think that you are sort of aligning important distinctions and comparing college education to the rates on a freeway.
Before you jump in, I'm going to add one more thing to that stream since you brought up Berkeley. Just one more point in there so we can broaden this a bit is you say that you have an ambition of this roll, as many people who do campaigns at Harvard, hopefully it rolls outward to other colleges. And these graphs over here about the endowment being much higher than tuition, that gets less and less true the less big the endowment is. And so if you're saying hopefully it's a revolution in universities, when it does get to Berkeley, when it does get to UVA, when it does get to, Michigan State, is all of your arguments for this the same case when they don't have large endowments? And also respond to what Daniel said, but I won't get that in there.
I mean, you've raised perfect points. Now, the truth is, I was surprised about the public school teacher figures in New York City. I went to the Harvard website. All I did was go on the internet and find the actual salaries, the minimum salaries of long-serving public school teachers in the New York City system. I typed in the numbers, and basically a family, and I assume one child, obviously if maybe the family has many, many children, the cost at Harvard would be lower, but basically 2 married public school teachers in New York City would either have to go massively into personal debt to fund their child's education at Harvard, or they would have to pay their entire life savings. And it's on the website, you type in the numbers, and that's what I got. Now, it's possible that I made some sort of mistake, but I don't think so. In other words, I looked at the numbers. Basically, New York City school teachers make more than one would realize because New York City is such an extremely expensive place to live. For example, a New York City school teacher, public school teacher, who's been around in the system for about 20 years, is making about $90,000 a year, $95,000 a year. So in other words, 2 of them, a couple, have a total family income of $180,000 or $190,000 a year, which sounds like a lot, except New York City is an extremely expensive place to live. So in other words, it doesn't go as far as it does in other parts of the country. If you type in those dollar figures to the Harvard website, you find out how much the family contribution is supposed to be, and it's in the many tens of thousands of dollars. If you then assume that pair of public school teachers has some savings that they've accumulated over the years, and you add that to the website, they basically have to liquidate $150,000 of their savings to fund their child's education. Now, maybe they should pay something, but Harvard has more money than they do. In other words, when you have a $38 billion hedge fund and 2 public school teachers in Queens or in Brooklyn, I think it's probably better for Harvard not to charge them anything. And I'm not saying Harvard is deliberately charging them all the money. I think the Harvard administrators do believe that their system is set up properly, but it's such a complex, convoluted financial aid system, they don't realize it's really gouging public school teachers in New York City. And in fact, when I mentioned some of that in a column I've written, one of the people I'm friendly with, who's one of the top union leaders in California, really sent back a cheering note saying this is exactly what you should do to Harvard. Force them to stop gouging all these people who, by New York City standards, are very middle-income families. And that's why 0 is better than a complicated formula. 0 is simple. 0 is easy to understand. If they hired 15 experts to develop this incredibly complex financial aid formula and forgot to put in local cost of living, they ended up hitting people who they didn't intend to hit. But, that's the problem with the complex system. Now, on the other question, which I'll get to, Harvard could very easily abolish tuition. If it takes 4% of Harvard's annual investment income earnings to abolish tuition. And, another 1 or 2% could abolish the cost of room and board for everybody as well. Trivial dollars. Yale, Princeton, and Stanford are nearly as wealthy as Harvard. If Harvard abolished tuition, they would immediately follow Harvard's lead and abolish tuition as well. MIT and Caltech are very much in the same ballpark. They could abolish tuition. After that, I haven't really looked at it. In other words, there are thousands of colleges around the United States. I think Williams is wealthy enough, they could probably abolish tuition. Various other colleges people have suggested, but certainly a lot of colleges, if they even couldn't abolish tuition, have endowments a lot large enough to massively cut or reduce tuition. But we're talking about the wealthy private schools. We're not talking about the public schools. The vast majority of American college students don't attend private schools. They attend UCLA, they attend Berkeley, they attend public community college, they attend these public schools. Now, most of those schools do not have large endowments. They could not abolish tuition. But why is tuition so high at those schools? For example, take UCLA and Berkeley, the UC system. In the mid-1970s, UCLA and Berkeley, total tuition in a year was $630 a year. Now it averages $15,000 a year. It's gone from $630 to $15,000. Now, inflation would have boosted it to about $2,700, $2,800 a year. But $2,800 a year is a lot lower than $15,000. I'm not an expert, and I've been focused mostly on Harvard and the Ivies, where I think I have the best information right now, and I've done the research. I think, though, what's happened at these public universities and public colleges is they've been forced to compete with Harvard and the Ivies and Stanford on the basis of the quality of the undergraduate life. In other words, 30 or 40 years ago, cafeteria food at Berkeley probably was much less good than it is today. The dorms were not as nice. You didn't have Olympic swimming pools. You didn't have vast numbers of very high-paid administrators all around campus. But tuition was $630 a year, and now it's $15,000. If Harvard abolished tuition, if Yale, Stanford, Princeton, MIT, Caltech, and all these other colleges zeroed out their tuition, taking Harvard's lead, that would force UCLA and Berkeley and all these other public colleges to start competing with Harvard, not on the basis of the fanciness of their Olympic swimming pools, but on the basis of price. They would be under massive pressure to cut their costs, to cut their expenses, and to cut their tuition. UCLA and Berkeley could not abolish tuition the way Harvard could, but I think if they really started cutting their costs, they probably could cut tuition 20, 30, maybe even 40%. That's not as good as it should be. It would be nice if they could move it back to $630 a year. But if you cut tuition at UCLA and Berkeley by 30 or 40% a year, that is a life-changing impact on the students right now that have $1.2 trillion of student loan debt. It's crippling. You have all these students who 30 or 40 years ago would graduate college, and once they got a good job and were able to save up some money, they would put a down payment on a house, and they would have a mortgage payment, and they would own a house. Now, instead of buying a house, they're still paying back their student loans, which is ridiculous. That should be changed, and the best way to do it is for Harvard and these other elite schools to go to $0 tuition. Then UCLA and Berkeley would be under tremendous public pressure to start competing on the basis of price rather than the basis of the fanciness of their cafeteria food.
I think that, again, you're missing two important points. The first that I'd like to raise, and I thought of it only as you were talking about the massive effect that Harvard would have as a thought leader in the abolition of tuition. Harvard has tried to lead the way in changing how college admissions happen. If I recall correctly, in 2006 and 2007, Harvard abolished early action and hoped that all other universities in the country would follow suit because it was reasoned that early action had a negative impact on minority and low-income enrollment. And just as in 1936, as went Vermont, so went Maine, as went Harvard in 2006, so went Princeton, and almost nowhere else. So I think that, we do have examples in which Harvard has tried to, use its status to militate for a change in how college admissions and how college financing is done and to increase access, and that hasn't necessarily worked. So I would just challenge you to think a little, to be a little more critical about the assumptions you're making. The second thing I want to raise is I actually think it's kind of ridiculous on its face to say that mostly the reason that state universities are so expensive today is because of fancy cafeterias. The fact is, in the 60s and 70s, under Pat Brown or Nelson Rockefeller in New York and California, state higher ed received a much higher percentage of the budget than it does today. So, and actually a lot of that has to do with why, some of that has to do with the fact that we have so many tax-deductible donations that go from wealthy individuals to private universities that use their endowments. Some have actually argued that tax-deductible donations to private universities are a wealth transfer from public universities, and that they take, that there should be a tax, that we should reinstitute taxes on those donations and redirect them toward public higher ed. So I just think that, again, I think that we're missing some nuance here in this discussion, so I just wanted to bring that up.
Well, first of all, on the tax side, it isn't clear to me why Harvard should be a tax-exempt hedge fund. In other words, maybe the government should start taxing Harvard's income like it does all the other hedge funds. And we're talking, if they did that to these big hedge funds that are pretending to be universities, that would generate billions of tax dollars. It could be used for all sorts of things, including the things you're suggesting. And if the government starts talking about maybe Harvard paying taxes, Harvard will abolish tuition so quickly, it'll make your head spin, because the dollars that they would pay from taxes, if they have to pay taxes like all the other hedge funds do, are vastly, vastly greater than what they would, save by abolishing
Ron,
tuition.
can you respond to
Right, getting back to early action. Let me ask, early action is a complex sort of issue. In other words, some universities benefit it, and some people like it, some people don't. If Harvard abolishes tuition, and then all these people who are going to Princeton and Yale and Stanford are paying $60,000 a year, upper middle class families that are good at lobbying and making a lot of noise. Harvard is free. Yale, Princeton, and Stanford are right now charging $60,000 a year. The parents of those students would march on campus, massively protest, and those universities would zero out their tuition immediately. There's no way they could keep tuition if Harvard zeroed it out. And that's the sort of thing that would start a huge tidal wave going across all these different parts of the United States, because people would say, look, suppose you're, for example, thinking of sending your son or daughter to a local community college that is a public institution. Does it really make sense if you're paying $10,000 a year when Harvard is free? All of these parents would put tremendous pressure on the people they elect to start pressuring these universities. And by the way, when I said Olympic swimming pools or dormitory food, I really haven't researched the issue. Those are possibilities, but from whatever I've read, the biggest single reason all these schools charge so much more public school tuition than they used to is the growth of administrative faculty, administrators, bureaucrats. For example, there was a good article in The Nation back a few months ago pointing out that back 20 or 30 years ago, I think the article was titled, "Why is Tuition So High When Teachers, Faculty Members Get Paid So Little These Days?" In other words, there are fewer and fewer full-time tenured faculty members, more and more very low-paid adjuncts. And tuition goes up and up. And the reason for that is back 20 or 30 years ago, there was one administrator for every 2 faculty members. Now there's one administrator for every single faculty members. In other words, the number of administrators has doubled. When you double the non-teaching staff of these colleges, and many of them, for example, in the UC system, many of these administrators make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, in some cases $500,000 a year or $600,000 a year. It really is absurd. They basically just sit in offices, and they're not part of the teaching staff. And then you have the classes being taught by adjuncts that get what, like $3,000 sometimes a quarter, or $5,000 a quarter, and have to get food stamps. It's absurd. So, there would be tremendous pressure on these public schools to cut their bureaucracy, to cut their waste, to cut their expenses, and to cut tuition 20%, 30%, maybe 40%. But Harvard and Yale and Princeton and these elite rich schools can set the example by going to zero tuition.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question on this topic. We'll have time later, but we want to get to the next topic too, because that's probably what's driven most of the controversy. But my final thing on this topic is I think much of the controversy and surprise and interest around this candidacy and this overseer's election is a question of motivation. And because we're not just debating an issue, we're debating if you should be elected as an individual, I think it's fair to bring up holistic question of your motivations and your slate's motivations. And there's interesting questions about motivation on the next issue, but I'll do some conjecture on this issue, which is the worst fear and interpretation of a California Republican who writes for the American Conservative, coming and criticizing Harvard and wishing for reforming universities and a tech background, is that there's this fear of Silicon Valley technologists who are conservative libertarian wanting to drastically change the university system and take out a area of American civic life that has been a bastion in their eyes for progressive values, and hopefully eventually have it be online education, you know, it run by market forces, much more affected by the market. And so, tell us, is that your motivation? What is driving you? What's causing you to do this? I think the worst interpretation of the motivation of Dan's side is simply that you're just arguing for the status quo. And if Harvard was already free and someone was arguing means test it, you would make the case of why Harvard should be free. So I would like you to each make the case that either that is your motivation or what your true motivation is here.
Okay, I mean, first of all, I should say I'm not really like a Silicon Valley libertarian. I mean, I'm a libertarian on some issues, but, you know, very non-libertarian on others. Like, for example, actually, I've been very heavily involved in the effort to raise the minimum wage. I actually played a pretty substantial role in that effort. And, you know, raising the minimum wage is about as non-libertarian a position as you can possibly take. With regard to my motivation, it's really fairly simple. You know, for probably the last 10 or 12 years, Harvard fundraisers or development officers or whatever they've called have, you know, occasionally been coming by to see me and asking for donations to Harvard. Now, I had a great experience as an undergraduate at Harvard. I like Harvard, I respect it, I'm still very friendly with some of the professors here. I think it's a great university. But when they would come and try to ask me for money, I would say, but why? Harvard has so much money already. Harvard's richer than I am. It's sort of like, you know, I use Google all the time. Google's a great service. Or, you know, I mean, basically the people who own Google, the top Google people are wealthier than I am. So if they ask me for like a charitable donation, I would say, but you have more money than I do. And, you know, well, for example, when the development office came to me, they would say, well, Harvard really needs the money. And I would say, but that's silly. You know, if you look at your chart, you can see basically that Harvard each year earns billions of dollars in investment income. Income from mortgage derivative securities, from timberland, from private equity holdings. And they also get like $1 billion a year in donations. So, you know, why don't you just abolish tuition? And they would say, well, you know, we'll get back to you on that. And they never did. I mean, the truth is, development officers are tasked with one major goal, and that's to raise money. They don't really know much about how the money's spent or what's going on with it, but, you know, if they raise a lot of money, they're promoted and become higher-ranking development officers. So, you know, I think what you have basically is a little bit of a sorcerer's apprentice. In other words, many years in the past, maybe Harvard needed the money. So Harvard built up this financial infrastructure, these investment officers, these donor development officers, and they became such a large part of the university that they really dominate the university right now. And so, you know, for example, back when I wrote my article a few years ago, my first article, I pointed out that in one of the particular years you look at, the 5 Harvard employees, or maybe, yeah, it was 5 Harvard employees, who were their investment managers, the 5 of them, Harvard employees, earned as much as the 500 faculty members combined. In other words, it really doesn't make sense. In other words, when you have 5 investment professionals making so many millions of dollars each, that they earned together more, each one of them earned as much as, I think, 100 or 150 top professors, you really are talking about a hedge fund rather than a university. And so the whole point about it is that, you know, what you really see is basically, I think, a very nice university. And, you know, it's good that over the years they've been able to accumulate so much wealth, so much more wealth, because it's all tax exempt that they don't really know what to do with. And so, you know, I'm not saying my idea that they should abolish tuition would really use up enough of their money. It's just a very small starting point. I think, for example, it would be probably a good idea if Harvard also abolished tuition for the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, probably abolish tuition for the law school, maybe abolish tuition for the med school. And they still have so much money left over every year that they'd still have a hard time to figure out what to do with it. But, you know, as a starting point, as a simple starting point, because that's the place where you can get the data most easily, we're starting off with Harvard probably abolishing college tuition. So, I mean, the bottom line is that they have more money than they know what to do with. And I think it makes sense for them to do it. And my motivation is very simple. You know, a few years ago, I wrote up an article pointing out that Harvard should abolish tuition. Harvard did nothing and paid no attention to me, which was sort of annoying because it was a good article. In fact, a lot of prominent people, including a lot of prominent liberals, tweeted it out and saying, oh, it's a great idea, Harvard should do this. And then basically about a year ago, the New York Times got in touch with me, and they asked me to contribute to a symposium on improving American higher education. So I wrote basically the same article saying Harvard should abolish tuition. And again, it got good response. Lots of people I know on the left, on the right, on the center said it's a great idea. Harvard really should abolish tuition. You're 100% right. How in the world can you get them to do it? And I put my thinking cap on and decided that when you look at what happened with the Harvard divestiture from South Africa movement, that a few students got together and put together a slate of candidates for the Harvard Board of Overseers, and once one of them ended up getting elected, Harvard immediately began divesting from South Africa. It seemed to me the same approach might be a good idea to get Harvard to abolish tuition, and that's what we ended up doing. And since I'd also written some articles about the tremendous unfairness of the Harvard's admissions process and the evidence of an Asian quota, I decided combining the two issues together would be a very good combination, and that's what we've done.
Well, I don't want to impugn Ron's motives. I'm happy to, if Ron doesn't have anything to say, I'm happy to move to the affirmative action question, which I'm sure will be more contentious perhaps.
Okay, let us do that. We shall move to the other question. So my opening question for both sides is, this is not explicitly a question about affirmative action, it's a question about transparency. And so my question for Ron is, you have written, many members of the slate, with the exception of Ralph Nader, have written critical articles on affirmative action. You host a blog that has hosted writers that have been on the right wing of racial politics. And so I think many are wondering, why have shadowboxing over transparency when this is really about affirmative action? But the question for Dan and Loran is, if we believe as an institution in affirmative action, why be afraid of transparency? Why defend it just by saying, oh, because we're so scared of the debate, we need to keep it secret? So why not just have a full-throated debate about the issue at hand? And so I'll open it up to both of you. And maybe let's start with Dan and Loran, since, or if you want to defer to the other, to Ron first, feel free to.
Could I go first, since
Yes.
I haven't really spoken this whole time?
Great, wonderful.
Cool. So I am actually not really sure what kind of evidence, what kind of information you would want from the administrator that would prove or disprove your theory of Asian quotas. But so these graphs, they look pretty damning, but I believe that on the y-axis we're talking here about how students are represented here as a proportion relative to their proportion in the United States. Is that correct?
In college-age population, exactly.
All right. Does that mean that you support? Well, actually, let me back up for a second. There are a few definitions of equality that people throw around interchangeably, and let me just make sure we're on the same page. There is the formal equality of opportunity, which means that all the applications should be treated the same and given equal worth, or whatever that means. There is the substantive equality of opportunity, which is like, oh, everyone from birth should have the same opportunities laid out for them, and it's possible that if they didn't have the same opportunities, college should do something about rectifying that. And finally, there is the equality of result, which is that we should admit a class that looks just like the actual population from which we're admitting, and it's unclear whether that is the United States or the world. Could I ask you which of these three, if any, you subscribe to?
Okay, what I probably should do is also just clarify the affirmative action issue, which is somewhat, offset to our platform on Free Harvard, getting to the original question asked. I mean, I should say, I've always been opposed to affirmative action, probably for 40 years. I make no bones about it. You know, I'd be very glad to debate the affirmative action issue itself. But our slate has no position on affirmative action. And in fact, what happened was when I was organizing the slate, since, you know, I was focused on these issues of Asian quotas about which I'd written, it turns out, for example, the first person I tried to recruit to the slate is actually a very strong liberal who supports affirmative action. And of the people on our slate, affirmative action is sort of a vague term that means, just as you're saying, different things to different people. I basically am opposed to affirmative action in the normal sense of the word that most people probably here would define it. Most of the other people on the slate with me, in fact, all of the other people on the slate with me, claim to actually support affirmative action under different definitions of that term. And, you know, in a sense, they define affirmative action one way, they argue that they support some affirmative action, not other affirmative action. I oppose affirmative action. And so, since our slate had such mixed opinions on affirmative action, it's not part of our platform. In other words, we take no position on it. What we're taking a position on is the issue of transparency. In other words, forcing Harvard to provide some more information as to why they pick certain students rather than other students. Transparency with regard to, for example, athletic recruitment, transparency with regard to, for example, legacies, families that have been to Harvard for generations, transparency with regard to race and ethnicity, transparency with regard to very gigantic cash payments being made to Harvard. We want to know why Harvard admits certain students, and we think it's a very healthy development. So, you know, again, I will be very glad to debate the issue of affirmative action, which I oppose with, you know, the other people on the panel with me, but it's not really part of a platform. And so, you know, that's not really what we're running. We're running on transparency. But, you know, getting to the point you raised, I basically say that I think it's unfair for Harvard basically, or other institutions, to make admissions decisions based on the race or ethnicity of the particular person applying. In other words, I think it's wrong to do that, and I oppose it. It's not our platform, but, you know, I personally oppose it. So, for example, and, you know, also the whole issue of, you know, relative diversity or something like that. You know, take the question of, for example, suppose you have somebody who's half Asian and half black, whose, you know, father is one and mother is another, and they're applying to Harvard. Should they be given an edge because blacks might be underrepresented? Or should they be given a headwind because Asians might be overrepresented? It gets very complicated. And, you know, the truth is, when you're looking within, for example, the white population, there are many white groups that might be very heavily overrepresented at Harvard, and there are other white groups that might be very heavily underrepresented. You know, there are groups, for example, based on ethnicity. There are groups based on socioeconomic status. There are groups based on geography. People from certain parts of the country might be much more likely to be at Harvard than other parts of the country. And, you know, it gets to be a very complicated calculation if you're talking about relative representation at Harvard to fulfill the ideal of saying that Harvard should look like the United States. And in fact, there's a very long article I wrote here, 30,000 words, that some of you might want to get copies of, that went through that in exhaustive detail. And it argued that Harvard claims, Harvard and the other elite institutions in the United States claim to support the twin goals of meritocracy and diversity. Now, to some extent, those goals might be in conflict sometimes, and Harvard might admit that, but those are the goals that Harvard claims to support. I argued that when you actually look at the data, both those goals have been pushed aside, and what dominates Harvard admissions might be called corruption and nepotism, which are very different types of things. And in fact, one proposal I had, and I'm not saying that, you know, it's not part of our slate, it's a radical proposal. It's far more radical than anything most people would ever propose. I argue that maybe what Harvard should do is admit the vast majority of their students by a random lottery. You can't get any more diverse than that. The argument I was making is that when you're talking about students, for example, that are right at the cutting edge of being admitted based on their academic performance. You have very many students that are right on the edge. 5 more points. Let's say, for example, Harvard went to a straight meritocratic system. Your test scores get you admitted or not admitted. It would provide enormous pressure on all these families to get the extra 5 points they need to get admitted. And in many Asian countries, East Asian countries like Japan or Korea, or to some extent China, it causes tremendous stress to students. They have to study nonstop to try to get admitted. What I argue is that a few points right at the edge probably doesn't make a difference. And maybe what Harvard should just consider as a thought experiment is saying that 80% of the Harvard spots should be assigned randomly based on those students whose academic performance is good enough that they could benefit from a Harvard education.
Sorry, I just want to address Peter's question.
Oh, sure.
Because I think we might be getting like, we should
Oh,
maybe
sorry,
proceed,
sorry.
stepwise, you know what I mean? But I'm happy to, get into racial affirmative action with you. I think that transparency could be a positive thing here. I mean, I think, listen, I think, I don't like the idea of multi-billion-dollar organizations concealing as much information from the public as they can. There's been a lot of questions about Harvard's endowment, how it's used, what it's invested in. It's really hard to get the university to be transparent. I agree with you. There's a sort of corporate structure that's erected itself around the university, which also feeds into it. The Crimson can't even get the Harvard Police Department to release police logs. I mean, so I would agree with you. There's a transparency issue. And it's not so much, I guess this is where I do question the motives. Because it's not, the idea in and of itself that the admissions office should be more transparent doesn't bother me. What does bother me, though, is the fact that I do think it's a sort of Trojan horse for, going after racial affirmative action as such. And while you mentioned, you are against racial affirmative action, very much on record, and I was really interested to read The Myth of American Meritocracy a few years ago, and so thank you for that. But most people on your slate, as I understand it, might support economic affirmative action, but also do, I think most of them oppose racial affirmative action.
It's not really, again, I'm very straightforward in where I stand. I oppose affirmative action. And, again, I have mixed feelings about economic. I'm talking about, when I say affirmative action, I mean racial, ethnic affirmative action. Socioeconomic affirmative action, I, think would probably be all right. It's reasonable. I mean, it's a more complex issue. But racial, ethnic affirmative action is what I say when I use the term affirmative action. The problem is, when you talk to, for example, most of the other people on my slate, they publicly say that they actually support affirmative action. And they've sometimes actually argued with people in the media who've characterized them as opposing affirmative action. In fact, in their statements, in the declarations and responses to the diversity group, they basically said they support affirmative action to some extent, but they think maybe it's been taken too far. Or they would support, for example, having students who come from certain ethnic groups being given some advantage in admission, but not too much of an advantage. And I mean, that's a fine position to take. And whether that means you're for affirmative action or you're against affirmative action is probably a subjective type of issue. And that's why I say they all claim publicly that they support affirmative action. And, again, they and other people can argue about what that term means, whether, basically, it's sort of an open question. While I'm much more straightforward, I say I oppose affirmative action, but since it's, Ralph Nader says he supports affirmative action, and since these other people on our slate say they support some affirmative action, but not too much affirmative action, it's simply not part of our platform. The Harvard Board of Overseers has absolutely no legal authority over admissions decisions. The only thing our slate would do if we won is would reflect a referendum vote of the 320,000 Harvard alumni. So our only power is what our platform stated and whether the alumni voted for that platform. If our platform states that it takes no position on affirmative action, and if people elect us, it's very unlikely that the university would change their affirmative action policy. Now, it could be that if the university becomes more transparent and the facts come out, certain parts of the affirmative action system may be so absurd or egregious that there may then be public pressure to change them, or maybe not. In other words, the university claims.
Doesn't that speak to your motive though,
Well,
right? You want, why do you, I mean, you don't want this data released in a neutral sense, perhaps, right? I mean, can we really believe that when you have these positions on affirmative action?
Here's the whole thing. Harvard University, I would guess probably that the vast majority of Harvard alumni support affirmative action. Again, if my slate members all support affirmative action, then I think Harvard University does, and all the alumni. Now, it could be that they support it rightfully, and it could be they support it incorrectly. And I think simply having more evidence of what Harvard is actually doing allows people to make a more.
I just want to highlight for you one of the ads that was going around on social media for this debate, and also for your slate, had an Asian child sitting at a desk with the tagline, "Doesn't she deserve to have a fair shot at Harvard too?" So I mean, clearly, you do want, there is behind this effort an attempt to alter how Harvard does its admissions.
Well,
Can you really divorce that? I mean, can you really divorce these two things and be credible? I mean, I think that, there's a sort of double game happening here. You want to present it as this sort of neutral policy, but clearly it has implications. Clearly it partakes of a national discourse with people, like Harvard Not Fair, for example. So clearly there's an effect, there's a desired effect that you or your slate hopes to have in releasing this data. And I support transparency, but I just think you should be, a little more forthcoming about maybe where you think that leads.
You've raised a very good one. Let me actually reply to it. That gets to the heart of this. In other words, I've never intended to make affirmative action part of our platform, because again, it's something popular with the Harvard community and that sort of thing. There's a key difference. Harvard's top administrators publicly declare that they support affirmative action. They publicly declare that they support diversity. Now, again, I might disagree with them, but that's their position. It's popular within the Harvard community, and again, so long as it's legal, that's fine. What I find trouble with is that they also claim that they have no Asian quota. Now, when you look at this chart, all these universities, or when you look at the 60% decline in Asian per capita enrollment over the last 20, 25 years, I think it's very clear that they're not being honest with the Harvard community. In other words, it's fine if they say, we support affirmative action, and the Harvard community supports affirmative action, okay. If they say, we support diversity, and the Harvard community supports diversity, that's fine. But if they say, we do not have an Asian quota, and they clearly do have an Asian quota, or at least there's very strong statistical evidence that they do, I think that's wrong. And I think the Harvard administration should be honest with the members of the Harvard community. In other words, if the Harvard administration says, we have an Asian quota because we support an Asian quota, that can generate a public debate. Maybe the Harvard community supports it, maybe they don't, but at least they're being honest. And we think it's important for a university to be honest with its students, with its alumni, with its faculty members, and transparency will force them to be, I think, a bit more honest in what they're really doing. So when I talked about transparency, it was really related more to the Asian quota thing, which I think they're being very dishonest about.
Excuse me, Ron, could I question your strong statistical evidence
Oh, sure.
in favor of the Asian quota? Let me write something on the board.
Sure.
So, there's a funny statistical effect that I had forgotten the name of. But let's suppose we have two groups, call them A and B, and let's suppose we are admitting them into two schools. Say, for example, the college and the extension school, which I believe are grouped together, right? So we'll both call them 1 and 2. In the first school, let's suppose that, what do I have? Like 10 people in group A apply, and 5 people in group B apply. And let's suppose we accept 1/5 of them. So there's 2 and there's 1 accepted, all right? Here in school 2, let's say we have 4 people from group A applying and 20 people from group B who apply. And let's suppose we accept half of them to school B, which is more accepted. And if you see here, this means that I should have written the fraction the other way, I'm sorry. But out of group A, if you bundle them all together, we have an acceptance rate of two people are accepted out of 14. Or sorry, 4 people are accepted out of 14. In this other group, we have 11 people are accepted out of 25. As you see, this is almost 1/2, right? And this is significantly lower. And so when you bundle all of these figures together, they can be deceiving. And I don't know if this is recent enough for you, but in what year is it? 1990, the Department of Educational Office of Civil Rights actually did an investigation into Harvard and found that Harvard did not discriminate against Asians on the basis of race. The reason why we have these figures are because there's a differential, both in terms of applicant pool and in terms of acceptance rates for School of Education, Extension School and the college. 2, there is between departments, for example, between STEM and humanities, there are different pools of applicants and in particular different acceptance rates. And if you take each of the individual departments or each of the individual departments, sorry, they actually did not find that there was such a discrepancy, right? It was only when we bundled them together. So the data that you provide is not in itself evidence in favor that there is an Asian quota. And in particular, this is particularly bad because this is not related to the applicant pool, but related to the population at large. And if you, as before, you're complaining that some white groups and some minority groups are overrepresented and some are underrepresented, that perhaps suggests that you take an equality of result standpoint. I don't know if that is consistent with what you want, but you did mention in your article that you wrote in, let's see, what year is it? In 1998, you wrote an article called "Some Minorities Are More Minor Than Others," and I quote, "For example, Asians comprise between 2 and 3% of the US population, with nearly 20% of Harvard undergrads." And later you continue, "Other than repealing the laws of mathematics, the only solution available to supporters of affirmative action would be to adopt a policy aimed at drastically reducing the number of Asians and Jews at Harvard, thereby furnishing more spots for other groups." So first of all, I'm confused as to exactly what is the position you're taking on Asian quotas. If you do want equality of results, which I think is possibly a very philosophically solid position, then we should have, I think that implies that we should have racial quotas for every racial group. And for the Asian quota, it would be much more restrictive than it currently is right now. And second of all, I'm concerned as to what kind of evidence would you want from the Harvard administration that would prove or disprove this claim about Asian quotas, given that the evidence you present clearly does not prove or
I would
disprove
press on the
that.
quota argument, slightly differently. I would just say that if we look at Harvard statistics for, university statistics across a wide range of schools over the past, couple decades, we see that, racial statistics are somewhat stable, generally, or at least that's my impression. I guess I have a question about, what's the sort of enabling criteria to substantiate a quota? Do you have to establish collusion? Do you have to establish an explicit policy? If the numbers is sort of paint by numbers approach that merely notices that statistics have trended in a certain way, might not be sufficient to establish that. And I think it's also, I think there's a certain ambiguity, right, in Supreme Court case law to begin with about what it means to take into account, racial criteria just as one factor among many, and what it means to establish a quota. To some degree, I think the ambiguity is not so much our fault, but the fault of higher forces. But anyway, I just wanted to add.
Before Ron answers, I'm just going to try to summarize that for the audience, and I'm going to also note that after Ron answers, we're opening it up for questions. So 3 questions seem to be in those 2 statements. One is a questioning of your statistics, and just a question on the numbers. They seem to say that your numbers were not saying what you are saying, they're saying, please rebut that if you wish. 2 is, what is your end goal here? What is a quota? Why are quotas bad? What is your goal at the end of this? And 3 is, what does transparency mean in the context of this? The day when Drew Faust looks at you after you won the Board of Overseers and says, give me your demands, and I will answer them. What do you write in that letter to her?
Sure.
So,
Can I add one thing
Yes.
to this discussion of statistics? I just want to add, there's been, the myth of American meritocracy, as you well know, was a very controversial essay that provoked other people to run the numbers, and some people found Ron's numbers to be very suspect. There was, I'm forgetting the name exactly, but someone looked at your analysis of Jewish representation at Harvard, for example, and found that you were using a very suspect method, right? I mean, you were looking at Jewish names that seemed Jewish to establish who is Jewish for your analysis. And this author effectively argued that you undercounted the number of let's say, Jewish applicants who are National Merit Scholarship winners and semifinalists, and that you overcounted the Jewish population. I mean, so I think that, I really respect your statistical work, but I also think that you have to, acknowledge that it's far from consensualist, right?
as someone whose name was changed from Clovis to Davis at Ellis Island, I appreciate that you're on that.
The whole thing there is, to be honest, there's really no case on the other side. In other words, basically, some people get very excited about certain issues, and when they get very excited, they sometimes sort of look for something that isn't there. I mean, basically, look.
That sounds like an argument that can be used against you, right?
No, but-
Well, I think it's-
To give an example, I mean, again, the standards I used are exactly the statistical standards that have been used in all the other books and analysis. In other words, a lot of the Jewish enrollment figures basically came from Hillel, the Jewish student organization, which everybody uses. Now, some of these people who were criticizing my paper claim that all of Hillel's numbers are fraudulent. They claim Hillel basically makes up these numbers and the Hillel numbers are totally wrong. Now, the New York Times and every other researcher uses the Hillel numbers. I can't say definitively whether they're correct or not, but everybody has always used them, including government agencies. And so, if my use of them is wrong, then everybody else is also wrong. And there really wasn't much of a case on the other side. Again, we're getting into the weeds of statistical details. But if you compare, for example, my analysis with the analysis that was used by some of these other people, that did very exhaustive analysis, that spent weeks of research to criticize mine, the numbers were almost identical. I'm not
Within
saying,
a factor of 5.
yeah, no, she made it up. She really made it up.
Well,
No, again, we're getting into the deals. I'll be glad to talk with you afterwards and show you some of the links. This was all debated back and forth 3 or 4 years ago when the article came out. All of it was dealt with, tens of thousands of words were expended. And I think the issue is fairly conclusively settled to anybody's outside opinion. I'll be glad to point to the references to some of the other people on the panel. With regard, for example, to some of the other points that were raised, let's see, we sort of took a detour on that.
So question 1 was about just questioning the stats, getting in the weeds on the numbers. I think I'll leave it as moderate. I'll say there are links on the other side that you can Google and read criticisms of Ron Unz's myth of American meritocracy, and I think see for yourself is the best we're going to get out of this debate, so we don't take the whole time going into that. 2 is, what do you mean by what is a quota to you? What is wrong with it? What is your goal once this is the, and 3 was, what does transparency mean to you?
With regard to transparency, I'm not an expert on transparency. In fact, when I was talking with some of the people about putting together this campaign, originally I was focused more on the Asian quota thing, because that's what I'd written about. But when we were discussing it, they said, no, that's too narrow a focus. It's much better to broaden it to the issue of transparency in general, which would address a lot of these other corrupt practices that are going on at Harvard and the other elite universities. For example, some of the people that I've been working with on this, like for example, Stuart Taylor Jr. has written a book on and gotten very heavily into the details of admissions policies. They, for example, say that Harvard apparently has one of the most detailed coding systems on admitting students. Apparently, it's incredibly exhaustive. Every student has something like 179 separate data points on their file, which say exactly how they stand on all these different criteria for admissions. And they argue, well, why not make all that data available on an anonymized basis? So in other words, basically, you obviously would take away the names so that nobody could tell who was being provided, but basically Harvard would just release the exact criteria that they allegedly use for admissions, including, for example, racial and ethnic criteria. And you could just match it against who gets admitted, and we can find out what's going on. And, you know, it seems to me that if it turns out that, you know, it's purely a coincidence that the Asian numbers have followed the trajectory that they have and that they've dropped by 60% in the last 20, 25 years, then, you know, that data would demonstrate that. But if it's more than a coincidence, then, you know, there would be a smoking gun that people could use. So I don't claim to be an expert on those transparency issues, but some of the people working with me have a tremendous amount of expertise. I'm going to give you an example. I've never actually been a Harvard interviewer. And so one or two of the other people in the group running with me have been an interviewer, and they've said, oh, there are all these check boxes they fill out on the forms and that sort of thing, and, you know, all that data could be made available on an anonymized basis. So I really would have to defer to more qualified people on that. And that's why one thing I should say is that zeroing out tuition is a very simple, easy goal that probably could and would be implemented very quickly if we end up winning, in effect, a referendum of the Harvard community. Increasing transparency is a much more complex issue that probably would require a lot of give and take with the Harvard admissions department, with Harvard faculty members, with top Harvard administrators, and with some of the people on my group that are more knowledgeable than me. But, you know, I think what we're talking about is simply, we don't have a specific demand, release everything, but we say that there should be greater transparency in the admissions process. On the issue of Asian quota, you know, it's interesting. Laurent brought up the question of, you know, what about the U.S. Civil Rights Department investigation of Harvard in 1990 or 1989? It's an interesting story. What happened was, in the late 1980s, there was a big flap in California with the UC system and with some of the elite East Coast universities like Harvard and Brown and Yale over a strange, sharp decline in the admissions rates for Asian students. In other words, fewer and fewer Asians were being admitted every year relative to other groups. What happened was, in California, where there's a large Asian population, they have some political power. The system basically admitted it was practicing Asian discrimination. There were also some legal changes. And any idea of an Asian quota was completely eliminated. And now, you know, the public websites of the UC system provide the exact data on the ethnic distribution of admissions, the ethnic distribution of applicants, and the ethnic distribution of enrollments, and there's nothing suspicious going on. What happened on the East Coast, where Asians have, and on DC level, the national level, where Asians are much fewer in number and have very little political power, is in effect the Justice Department looked at the books and said, oh, there's nothing bad going on here. Harvard, you know, is doing everything fine. They closed the books. And strangely enough, the moment the Justice Department closed the books on the Civil Rights Administration investigation of Asian enrollment admissions practices at Harvard, the Asian admissions rate at Harvard started dropping very rapidly. It's an interesting coincidence. As soon as they basically closed their investigation, the Asian per capita enrollment at Harvard started dropping very rapidly for the next few years. And that's very strange, since exactly in that same period of time, the Asian American population in the United States was rising very rapidly. So the bottom line is, it just seems to me suspicious that the Asian American college-age population has more than doubled in the last 25 years, while the number of Asian American students actually admitted to Harvard has mostly declined during that same period, or at most is stable. Now, it could be that Asians no longer do that well in school, that they don't study, that they don't do well academically. It could be that Asians no longer apply to Harvard the way they used to apply, but it seems troubling to me that you see a 60% decline in the per capita enrollment of Asian American students at Harvard, and similar declines in most of these other elite universities, and that the numbers have converged to a very stable level. And I think those numbers, certainly, if we were talking about any other sector in American society, and there were questions of racial discrimination, if this were a police department or a fire department or anything like that, this would be considered a super smoking gun of racism. The reason it's not considered that way at Harvard is Harvard is very powerful. A lot of senators, a lot of congressmen want their sons or daughters to be admitted to Harvard. And they think, either rightly or wrongly, is maybe if they, for example, start taxing Harvard's hedge fund, maybe if they start making trouble for Harvard, then maybe their sons or daughters will not be admitted to Harvard. And I think that's a bad situation. I think what we really need is much more transparency in the admissions process, and find out why the number of Asian students at Harvard dropped so rapidly as soon as the Justice Department closed their investigation of Harvard around 1990 or 91.
I want to open up to questions soon, but I want to do two things. One, I want to give you, Lorraine, a quick response. I have a question, and then we're going to open up to questions.
You say that this decrease started happening at as soon as the 1990 investigation?
A year or two later.
So actually in this, the Myth of American Meritocracy article that you distributed, which was, when was this written? In 2012, which I hope is recent enough for you, you have, so in the beginning, while you do talk about Asian quotas, about halfway or more than halfway through, I don't really remember where, it said you have the quote, "There appears to be no evidence for racial bias against Asians, even excluding the race-neutral impacts of athletic recruitment, legacy admissions, and geographic diversity." And then later you elaborate and say, "Do we really want to produce an entire nation of Asian tiger moms of all ethnicities and backgrounds, probably with horrible consequences for future mental health, personal creativity, and even long-term academic performance of the next generation?" And I read this as you're concerned that the Asian population at Harvard is too large, but perhaps I'm reading that wrong.
Just a factual thing there. I believe that segment of the paper you were being rhetorically sarcastic, I believe. Yeah.
I mean, what I basically was saying, again, it's a 30,000 word article. I mean, it's a fairly long article and goes through a lot of stuff. I was starting off showing very much strong evidence of convergence of the exact percentage of Asian enrollment at all the elite schools in a very suspicious way, especially because the Asian population was increasing so rapidly in exactly that same period of time. I then went through various comparisons, various metrics that could be used to see whether it was being caused by other factors, less doubtful, less, unfair factors. And then I started saying, well, let's see what approach should the universities take in admitting students. One approach, I said, for example, let's use the possibility of a super diverse approach. In other words, basically where every group is represented, every ethnic group and sub-ethnic group is represented exactly according to their percentage of the population. And I showed why that really wouldn't work very well. First of all, I would oppose that ideologically, but even if I supported it ideologically, it would be terribly complicated. For example, you have Mississippi, which is a WASP population, and then you have Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a WASP population. Mississippi WASPs are very poor. Greenwich WASPs are very wealthy. Should there be a WASP quota that gets Greenwich, Connecticut WASPs admitted to Harvard because there's a large population of Mississippi WASPs? And I pointed out for various reasons that
Do you, in fact, so it's unclear whether by using this complaint you are, because this complaint could be read both ways, both in terms of supporting equality of results and not in terms of supporting equality of results. But you claim that it supports that we should not have equality of results?
Well, I mean, what I basically said was pure diversity wouldn't work. I then switched over to pure meritocracy, which is normally, for example, a lot of conservatives who oppose affirmative action say we need a purely meritocratic admission system. You know, absolutely test scores and grades. And I explained why that really wouldn't work. In other words, it would put tremendous pressure on students to study incredibly hard to get the extra 2 points they need to be admitted rather than denied admission. And so I said, pure meritocracy wouldn't work very well, pure diversity wouldn't work very well. And I came up again with an entirely new idea, which is basically a mixture of the two based on a random use of a partial random lottery. Now, again, it's not part of our Free Harvard platform. And you can, read it in my article and decide whether my thought experiment suggestion made sense, but basically argued that a portion of Harvard students should be admitted based on purest meritocracy, rank order. But a much larger portion should be admitted randomly based on those students who could do reasonably well with a Harvard education. And that article was more of a thought experiment rather than anything having to do with the actual policy we're proposing with our Free Harvard platform. I just was saying that, if it's a rank order meritocracy, where 5 extra points on an SAT means you get admitted or denied admission to Harvard, there's tremendous family pressure for every student to study incredibly hard, to go to cram schools, to follow the Amy Chu Tiger Mom approach, all this sort of stuff. And it just isn't a healthy environment. And basically, you end up having everybody work incredibly hard. Nobody benefits, everybody suffers. And then I just was exploring other possible options.
That's very clarifying, and I think that's clarifying to a misconception, if that's true, that's your motivation. Because, so, one thing that hasn't been talked about, and this is my final question, we're opening up for everyone, and if you could keep your answer in a minute or two. Let's talk about that top line, which is Caltech, I believe.
Sure.
The fear among most Harvard alumni, I'm in the belief that moderators should not pretend to be neutral when humans aren't neutral. I also have this fear, is that Harvard becomes Caltech, or Harvard becomes Stuyvesant High School, and Stuyvesant, not from New York, I'm from DC, but Stuyvesant High School, because at Caltech and Stuyvesant High School, despite being in locales that are incredibly diverse, that have very high populations of Black and Latino people, I believe Stuyvesant High School admitted single digits.
72% Asian, about 25% white.
Yeah, and in Caltech, in California, which has very high populations, minority populations, also has disproportionately low, as I saw on their admissions website, as you said. And so the fear is Harvard becomes Caltech, or fear becomes Harvard becomes Stuyvesant. And you're saying that that's actually not your position.
Oh, no, right, exactly.
You don't want this meritocratic testing.
I just think an ultra-meritocratic system doesn't work very well, and that's the argument I was making. In other words, basically, the two ideals that Harvard claims to support are meritocracy and diversity. I argue that either of them, taken in an extreme way, really don't work very well. And I showed why they wouldn't work very well. And, when you're talking about Caltech, the reason I used Caltech is because all the experts, all the journalists agree that Caltech has the most utterly objective admission system, without any sort of corrupt practices, without any unfairness. In other words, the purest sort of meritocratic system. And just as interesting, when you plot the Asian American enrollment at Caltech, it follows exactly the growth of the Asian American population. In other words, the number of Asian Americans in America doubled during that period, and the number of Asians at Caltech roughly doubled in that period. And then you compare it with the number of Asians dropping at most of these elite Ivies, it's very suspicious. So, that's one thing. And by the way, you might be not quite correct about Caltech's admissions practices because, for example, I think last I looked, Caltech actually is 12% Hispanic, which is about the same Hispanic population.
We were talking about Stuyvesant High School.
Yeah, no, but Caltech was raised. Caltech, I think basically Caltech is roughly the same Hispanic enrollment that Harvard does. And again, Caltech, probably practices less affirmative action or less diversity than virtually any university in the United United States. So, and you know, remember, I mean, we're talking about Caltech being in the middle of Los Angeles, which is a very heavily Hispanic area. California is very heavily Hispanic. So I'm not saying, you know, Caltech is 35% Hispanic. Basically, Caltech is roughly as Hispanic as Harvard is. Where Harvard supposedly has a lot of affirmative action, Caltech doesn't.
Just a factual clarification. I pulled it up here. Caltech is 27% white, 45% Asian in their fall enrollment, and 16%, which they list, they don't break out Black and Latino, they say underrepresented minorities. So if you add up all the Black Caltech students, Latino Caltech students, it's only 16%.
Blacks are basically about 1 or 2% of Caltech, and Hispanics are about 15%. There's actually a public website that shows all this data, which is public data, so anybody can find it. In fact, what I ended up doing was downloading it all, so you can just go to our website and you can look at the exact trajectory of ethnic enrollments or gender enrollments at every one of America's every one of America's 5,000 universities for the last 25 years. It's all on a public website, but the public website has the data in such an inconvenient form, nobody can find it. And, you know, I just put it up, download and put it up.
Can I just jump in? I just wanted, you know, to add something about your scheme, and then I'm so sorry, you know, about the questions. I do think that even under your scheme, which combines, you know, straight meritocracy with a larger sort of partial lottery, you could still have a scenario in which minorities are radically underrepresented. Maybe that doesn't trouble you. It does trouble me personally. I think that, you know, there are numerous good arguments to make on behalf of why racial affirmative action should be practiced to bolster underrepresented numbers. I think, you know, I think it's key to social cohesion in this country, as was pointed out in the Grutter decision, when, you know, by Senator Day O'Connor, was very swayed by amicus briefs from the military about sort of group cohesion would be undermined if, you know, there was a sort of mismatch between the higher-ranking military officers and lower-ranking military officers. That's one thing. I also think, you know, something we learn at college, something I learned at college, is that my experience is not generalizable to all people in the way that I once thought. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, interacting with people of different backgrounds and races. And I think, you know, I've seen you say that you don't think that diversity is valuable in and of itself. And maybe that's just a first principle disagreement between us. And I just want to raise that because I don't think we've talked about that much in this discussion. So I just wanted to flag that.
So big question, but if you could keep it quick, I bet you're going to get a chance in some of the audience questions to elaborate further.
Okay, the problem with a lot of these sort of diversity or affirmative action admission systems, even if you leave aside the ideological problems I have with them, is they decide what categories to choose. For example, there's a lot of evidence that admissions practices at elite universities discriminate against students who have ideological backgrounds, not racial or ethnic, but ideological backgrounds that are discordant with that of the admissions officers. For example, one of the most striking figures I saw in a very scholarly book that came out a few years ago, very well reviewed, is that, for example, if a student who's applying to Harvard or the other elite schools has done well at 4F, you know, the farming program, or for example, if they've been very active in the Rotary Club or certain student organizations, they're less likely to be admitted than if they've done nothing. And I think what's probably going on is the admissions officers say that people who fit a certain ideological profile maybe shouldn't be at their university. And so the problem is, when you have this sort of like system where they choose who to admit and not admit, they say, well, we're going to be diverse in this category, we're going to be diverse in that category, but we're not going to be diverse in these other 5 categories. We're going to be very non-diverse in those categories, and that's unhealthy. The advantage of a straight lottery random admission system is it's automatically diverse in everything, because you can't get more diverse than a random number, a random sampling process. And that prevents these admissions officers from deciding who to admit. There's basically a book that came out by a top New York Times writer describing the actual admissions process as an elite Wesleyan, sort of top elite liberal arts school. And the people basically decided who to admit very heavily based on the ideological views of the applicants. In other words, they said, oh, this student seems to oppose the death penalty. We'll admit them. This other student, that's a bad student. You know, that student basically supports the death penalty, or might be a Republican who won't admit that student. I think that sort of biased, non-diverse admissions process is a very bad thing. And if you want true diversity, fair diversity, you go with the random lottery, rather than the sort of corrupt pseudo-diversity you right now have at Ivies like Harvard.
Do you believe that the applicant pool is representative of whatever you mean by like whatever the pool that the students should be choosing from?
The pool would be a lot more representative if tuition would be free.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. Keep your questions short and let's keep your answers concise. Okay, I'll get you in the back in the room.
Hi, as a social experiment, even the rumor of free tuition will broaden the application pool, and the prep work to get to Harvard will be determined who gets here. So, being a tax-exempt organization, they have to comply. So just the rumor of this is an opportunity to revamp the whole admission process.
I agree very much with that. I mean, when you look, for example, at the applicant pool at Harvard, it's a very non-diverse applicant pool, especially in socioeconomic status. And, you know, Harvard says that they try to attract students from all sorts of different backgrounds, but, you know, what they're doing right now just isn't working. And I think free tuition would be the sort of thing that would draw a lot more applicants to Harvard, all sorts of backgrounds.
I would just, I would just, posit again that this is to some extent conjecture, and that Harvard has tried experiments to boost enrollment by changing its admissions practices, e.g. early action that, didn't seem to lead to massive change throughout the university system, so.
Next question. Yeah, you're right there.
So, in the Myth of American Meritocracy article, you write that, quote, the dominant group of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, largely descended from among the earliest American settlers, was generally aligned in culture, religion, ideology, and ancestry with perhaps 60% of America's total population at the time, and therefore hardly represented an alien presence. By contrast, a similarly overwhelming domination by a tiny segment of America's current population, one which is completely misaligned in all these respects, seems far less inherently stable. So, given that, and given that elsewhere in the Myth article, you write that there appears to be no evidence for racial bias against Asians, is the problem you're saying not that there's any problem with Harvard and Asians, but instead the problem is with Harvard discriminating against white people?
Well, no, I mean, what I'm basically saying is Harvard has seemingly a very biased, skewed admission system that's entirely opaque and produces results that are very, very bizarre. I mean, the point is, when you have, for example, students from a very narrow sort of background being so very heavily overrepresented in a university, very heavily
Which one are you talking about? Are you talking about Jews?
Yeah, Jews and to some extent Asians and that sort of thing. When you're talking
So you think there are too many Asians at Harvard?
No, I'm not saying that. What
You
I'm
think there are too many Jews at Harvard?
Well, what I'm saying is basically, if you look at the ratio.
So you are saying there are too many Jews at Harvard?
I'm not saying too many Jews, but I'm saying basically, when you look at the ratio, here's the whole thing. When you're talking basically about admissions process that's entirely secret and opaque, and when you have, for example, the enrollment of students at Harvard that seems very, very sharply discordant with other measures of academic performance in the high school applicant population, it raises all sorts of troubling questions. And I think basically it's a very good idea if Harvard reveals how it decides to pick students. And right now, I mean, basically when you read these books of admissions officers, and they basically say, we pick students who we feel will fit in at Harvard, or fit in Wesleyan, fit in ideologically, fit in culturally, fit in ethnically. I think that's a very good idea.
I would just add, please.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like if you're saying that we need people who are aligned in culture, religion, ideology, and ancestry, then you...
I'm not saying you need it, but I'm saying basically a system in which basically application rate, in which admissions rates have no connection to the apparent academic performance of the group involved, and instead basically.
Those values that just listed aren't related to academic performance either. I mean, sorry, so the criteria that you just mentioned earlier about values, about values, ideology, and ancestry are also not related to academic concerns, right?
Exactly. That's the problem. In other words, we have an opaque admissions. Now look, here's the bottom line. You have admissions officers who are quoted in a book that was widely praised, written by a top New York Times reporter, saying, I didn't admit that student because I hadn't realized she was so strongly opposed to the death penalty. If I'd known she was really opposed to the death penalty, I definitely would have admitted her. That sort of thing. That's not a healthy situation when you have students being admitted based on their ideological profile when, the results are discordant with that of American society. In other words, if Harvard wants to say, we are admitting students based on factors that have nothing to do with their academic performance, nothing to do with their academic ability, and only based on the fact that they might be liberals who have this set of views that we feel fit in at Harvard, I don't like that, but at least they should be honest about it. And the problem is Harvard is not honest. These other schools are not honest. And I think what you end up with is a very skewed community that does not reflect American society. And again, one of the most troubling results is that for some applicants to Harvard and these other elite schools, the better they do, the more leadership they show in certain high school activities, the less likely they are to be admitted.
How is this relevant to representing the American society?
Well, because basically people are being admitted sometimes based on their ideological or sociological profile.
But you also have a preference for certain ideological profiles, is that correct?
No.
Oh, you don't? But then, could you...
Sorry, I think the inconsistency in Ron's position is that you seem very concerned, Ron, about ideological conditioning and norming that institutions engage in. Think about the norming that test processes engage in. It's true, right? We know that IQ, we know that SAT, we know that these measures are not pure measures. They partake of cultural biases. We know that when assessments are framed in certain ways to certain populations, there's a reality of stereotype threat, which results in people doing worse. So I just think simply, you're concerned about one sort of norming or credentialing that happens, but you're not also concerned with how other, let's say, biases are operating or structuring people's performance or ability to access the education they want. So I'm skeptical of your presentation of merit. I think that we should extend to it your concerns about norming.
Could I footnote that with a quote from your Myth of American Meritocracy, which you say, quote, "Following the 1991 collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union, some observers noted with unease that the United States was left as about the only remaining large and fully functioning multi-ethnic society, and the subsequent collapse and disintegration of ethnically diverse Yugoslavia merely strengthened these concerns." So I read this, perhaps wrongly, as saying that you think that the ethnic heterogeneity of the United States could lead it to become a failed state such as Yugoslavia if not proper precautions are maintained in its leadership?
It's certainly a significant risk factor. And in fact, the interesting thing about former Yugoslavia is Yugoslavia was always cited by advocates of whatever we want to call it, affirmative action diversity, as the right way to run a society. In other words, Yugoslavia always allocated its government positions and other things based on all these different ethnic criteria. It was the shining example of the way you run a multi-ethnic society. In other words, apportioning the goods based on these different categories. And didn't really work out very well. So again, my approach is always much more towards the assimilative approach. And I've probably published 400,000 or 500,000 words on all these subjects over the years, with the Myth of American Meritocracy certainly being a big part of it. But getting to the issue of test scores, which had just been raised before. The interesting thing is when you read these admissions officers, they basically come out and state that probably 90% of the applicants to Harvard would do pretty well. If they came here, they would get benefit out of it. They would do fine if they were Harvard students. And they also state that, many times it's very difficult for them to decide which students to admit and which students not to admit. And that's why my suggestion which again I make more as a thought experiment, it's not part of our platform, is that all these students are relatively indistinguishable in the likelihood that they would benefit from a Harvard education. And the test score differences that they have are not that far apart. It's an extra 10 points here, 20 points there. It means maybe they had a lucky day on the SAT or an unlucky day. I think maybe the best thing, the simplest approach would be to admit them based on lottery. So in other words, you would have one group admitted based on complex rank order academic performance, which can be easy to distinguish at the high end. And then for all these other students that are so clustered closely together in academic performance, in the high school level, maybe it just makes sense to sort of pick them randomly. And you can't get more diverse than a random
Hold on, I'm
lottery.
gonna cut you off there. Any, we're gonna go to another question. Any other questions? You're right there.
I wanted to return to the question of this tidal wave of pressure on universities to cut tuition that would emerge if Harvard abolished tuition, which you argued was very obvious. But Harvard, we know that Harvard isn't in competition with public universities for the same students in the vast majority of cases. In fact, we know the vast majority of students go to institutions that aren't selective. So if I'm an average high school student from St. Louis, I've been admitted to the University of Missouri and I'm considering going there, chances are I haven't been admitted to Harvard and I'm not considering going to Harvard. So there's nothing that I can see in my college decision that would be, there's nothing that I can see at stake in my college decision that would apply pressure on my public university to slash tuition. So I would challenge you to justify what the mechanism is
Sure.
there that would.
Before you answer, we started it on Harvard time of 10 minutes after, so we're gonna go another 10 minutes. So.
Do we have to be out of here by?
Matt, can we go another 10 minutes? Okay, great.
Sure. Well, I mean, with regard to that, there are two separate aspects. First of all, in terms of the direct follow-on wave of Harvard abolished tuition, I think Yale, Princeton, Stanford would be under enormous pressure to follow, since, you look at the charts. I mean, they're basically in very much the same category as Harvard. Same thing for a few other elite universities, MIT, Caltech, maybe Williams, maybe a few others. So that's one category. I think that would happen very quickly. With regard to the vast majority of American college students who attend these public schools, the effect would be more complex and more slow-moving. It would certainly take some time. First of all, there really is a lack of applications from students from that background. In other words, a lot of, for example, Midwestern students who probably academically would do fine at Harvard. They might even do, better than a lot of the Harvard students who currently come here. I think they would suddenly start considering applying to Harvard if Harvard was free and the University of Missouri, for example, wasn't. And so, that's where you get a wave of much greater diversity, socioeconomic and geographical diversity, in terms of Harvard applicants. So, that would be a positive effect. Second of all, if these top national elite universities, which are very wealthy, all became free, that would put a lot of pressure on these public universities to compete based on price, based on cost. And so I'm not saying they would eliminate tuition, but a lot of the local elected officials would start saying, well, you really have to do everything you can to cut costs, to cut waste, to cut bureaucracy, to cut administration, and at least reduce, though not certainly eliminate tuition. So it wouldn't solve the problem. Tuition would probably still be high, too high at all these public places. But maybe instead of tuition rising every year at 10% or 5% or 3%, maybe they would be able to cut tuition by 20 or 30%, and which is better than nothing. But again, my research, my direct research has been focused on a limited number of these most elite and wealthiest universities. And I've also looked at the UC system because, I'm in California. And I think there would be benefit pressure on them, but it certainly wouldn't be perfect. It would take probably a few years to work its way through the system.
Lorian, response?
Yes, you mentioned earlier that if we zeroed out tuition, then it would have a great increase in the number of applicants, and it would also cause other schools to compete. So the same arguments actually be given for affirmative action, where it is, in fact, it has been argued in the Fisher versus U of Texas case, where it was because of affirmative action, that so many more students are interested in applying to Harvard and who would not have otherwise considered it, and that other colleges have used Harvard as a model for interaction, and in order to decide how they themselves would also admit applicants. So I question the inconsistency there.
To be honest, I'm skeptical of that argument. I haven't looked at the data. To be honest, I haven't been following any of the Supreme Court or legal challenges to affirmative action for the last 10 or 15 years. All I know about them is what I've occasionally read in the New York Times. So I'm not up on the details of it. One or two of the other people involved in the slate with me probably, in our overseer slate, have been much more, involved in those issues, and they would know more about it. I'm skeptical of that argument. It may be true, maybe not true. But, it seems to me that I think people generally apply to Harvard more because they think it's a very elite university with a great, reputation and will help them get a job on Wall Street or something.
If you remind me afterwards, I can send you sources.
Okay,
I mean,
sure.
we can exchange contact information.
The way we're gonna do is with the final questions is we'll have each of you say them, and then they're all on the table, and we'll make sure they get to all of them. So,
One other thing I should say is, I think we have some extra time with the room, and I'm glad to stay around here long and individually answer any sort of questions or hold any discussion anywhere you have, because, again, these are important issues, and, since I flew out here, I might as well use my time effectively.
great. So, what's your question?
Yeah, so the premise of kind of the admissions portion of your platform seems to be that there is an implicit or existing some form of quota for Asians, correct? So just, that's one component.
There's strong statistical evidence
Okay.
for that. Now, when I say quota, I think it's a very soft quota.
Sure.
In other words, what's basically happening is
Can I finish my
admissions-
question?
Oh, go ahead, sure.
So that would imply that there is an excess of Asian students who are applying who are, through whatever process that the admissions department employs, are not being admitted to the college. So I'd like you to help me square the circle, because I'm looking at data, publicly available data that's been given by the Dean of Admissions, which says that in my year and in the year after me and this incoming year, roughly 20% of the applicant pool was Asian. And that seems to pretty well correlate with this line you're
Including extension school data,
No,
which is why the numbers are so
No.
different.
Well, so I'd like